So good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this final technical session of the ICRP 2019 symposium. I can't quite believe we're here. So the panel discussion this afternoon on radiological protection in space will provide our panellists and the audience to, I think, reflect on the discussions from today and you know, what will be the future challenges for space exploration, in particular with radiological protection, and what some of the next steps need to be. We actually have 7 panellists. Gordon Cable, who was originally supposed to be on our panel and also the co-chair of today, couldn't resist. He's being a bit naughty in being here, but really wanted to engage and be part of our panel discussion this afternoon. So I really thank you, Gordon, for coming along. So I think everybody knows me. I'm Gillian Hirth. I'm the Deputy CEO at ARPANSA, and my background's in radiochemistry and radioecology, and so it's not space related, but I think I'm really happy to be able to be here and moderate the discussion this afternoon. I think that today's discussions will also be useful for my own work, having been recently invited to participate in the Space Medicine and Life Sciences Working Group that Gordon is chairing. This is a group that's been established to support the Australian Academy of Science National Committee for Space and Radio Science to deliver a decadal plan for science in Australia, including a focus on space medicine and life sciences. With the recent establishment of the Australian Space Agency and also recent agreements such as the one signed with NASA in the last few months, it's important for us to determine in Australia how to best position ourselves in the international space life sciences landscape over the coming decade, to understand what work's being done nationally and internationally, and to identify areas of opportunity, areas for action and leadership in space medicine. So for me, this has been a wonderful opportunity to learn, meet others and hear from those working as experts in the field of space radiation research. So without me rambling on too much more, because I think everybody else in relation to space has probably a lot more interesting things to say, I'll have each of the panellists shortly introduce themselves if they've not been introduced today already, and just have a few minutes to reflect on the presentations from today and where they see the future challenges, but also what the next steps are in radiological protection in space. So I'll ask Dr. Thirsk. Yes, with the mic's fine. So thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Again, I'm so grateful that I was invited to participate in today's Space Day session at the RCIP symposium. I've learned so much. All of the speakers had presentations that were relevant to my thoughts and what I need to know as a former astronaut and as someone engaged in trying to motivate politicians and society to consider further exploration in deep space exploration. So for example, I learned that lower basal metabolic rates seem to be associated with less radiation damage to DNA and to cell matrices. That was new knowledge that I gained today. I also learned that at a time of solar minimum, when the chances of SPEs and the strong solar wind are diminished, is not all good news. That there's higher incidences or higher fluxes of galactic cosmic radiation, which can also do nasty things to the human body in space as well. When I was young, I grew up in an era in the 1960s and the 70s when the Apollo moon landing missions were taking place. Without a doubt, that inspired me in my educational path and also in the career path that I took. And I ended up living a childhood dream, and what that is to have flown in space and be part of great human efforts to push back the frontiers of spaceflight. And so I want the same today for today's generation. I just might be a reflection of my age, but I sense that the spirit of exploration is waning. And that might just be because of the era we live in, where information and communication technologies are taking over society. So I really think that a Mars or a deep space exploration initiative taken place not by one nation, but by a collaboration of many nations would be positive. The showstoppers out there are certainly leadership. There's a lack of leadership right now, political will. The budget, it's going to be extremely expensive for us to go to deep space. And as we talked today, there's a lot of technological challenges. But I really think that some of the major challenges facing us and preventing us from going to deep space tomorrow are medical. So healthcare delivery to deep space astronauts, to life in a 1/3 G environment on Mars. We don't know if that's good or if that's bad. And then radiation protection as well. The ionizing radiation flux will be deeper in transit and on the surface of Mars. So some of the discussions that we heard today were made me feel optimistic that we're converging on a solution, and that it will be realistic in 20 years for us to go.
Gordon Cable. I'm chair of the Space Life Sciences Committee of the Australasian Society of Aerospace Medicine, and as Gillian mentioned, I'm currently chairing the working group that's putting together a decadal plan in space medicine and life sciences, which is a wonderful initiative and a first, in fact, for the National Committee of Space and Radio Science. It's the first time we've considered that as a discipline. And it's very timely, given the recent announcements, of course, of the Australian government and Australia's involvement now in what is, by its very nature, a human spaceflight program, which is the next exploratory missions to the moon and onwards to Mars. I'm also, in another guise, a flight surgeon with Defence, and have really worked mostly in aviation for the majority of my career, and it's really only in the last 5 years I've been involved in space, and largely through meeting Bob and other colleagues and developing courses in space medicine here in Australia, which also is a first. There are so many challenges to explore deep space. Radiation is just one of them, but I don't think they're insurmountable. I think that the question is often asked, and we heard it asked this morning. I was here briefly, and I regret missing most of the day. I'm coming at this cold, so forgive me if I've missed some of the topics. But the question was asked this morning: why send humans at all? Why not just send robots? Why do we need to overcome challenges, not least of which is radiation? And I think the answer given this morning was good, but I think it comes down to the human need to explore. The fact that humans, by their nature and their genetic makeup, are explorers ever since humans walked the planet. And humans are much better at doing a lot of things than robots. Robots are, we think, we make decisions, we make judgments, we do things more quickly, we're more capable in terms of dexterity than robots, and we can do things in real time. And I think there's nothing to replace that, the human experience of exploration, of actually going somewhere and seeing something. And I think Bob made the point about the inspiration as well for the rest of humanity that bestows, the stimulus to study STEM and the desire to become an astronaut and to explore. So I think we need to solve the radiation problem for all those reasons. Part of it will be going faster with propulsion systems, but I think there is a lot of work to be done in shielding technologies and shielding techniques. And I think, as Bob said, we are going to do this collaboratively. Australia has a lot to contribute, and if we're going to explore deep space, humanity needs to do it collaboratively, and Australia needs to be involved in that.
So I'm Nikki Coleman. I'm a space ethicist with UNSW Canberra Space and also the Royal Australian Air Force, and you heard from me earlier, so I won't go over that again. The thing that I found fascinating today was around hibernation and lower basal metabolic rates and how that impacts on physiology and also on radiological protection. I think that will be fascinating research in the future, and how you do that ethically on humans is going to be tricky. Speaking, I think, next steps for radiological protection in space, what would make my heart sing is to see, alongside our researchers and our engineers and our scientists looking at bigger and better ways to actually protect astronauts. We actually look at the ethical issues about radiological protection alongside that. And I'd just like to say ethicists are cheap. We don't need laboratories. And if you want the name of some space ethicists, I'm happy to give you a whole heap of names. But I'd like to see not only ethicists working in this area, but also people such as yourself contemplating and thinking about the ethical implications of what you're doing in the future and also potentially what you're doing in your laboratories.
Hi, my name is Mélanie Ferlazzo. I am a ANSTO postdoc, freshly arrived. My studies are based on the effect of space radiation on DNA repair and on the mitochondria. That's what I'm going to do at ANSTO. My background is more into radiotherapy and the effect of the person that are exposed to those doses, and especially the individual radiosensitivity linked to those exposure. And so from this background, I think that the radioprotection space has a lot in common with what you find in clinic, which is the need of efficient biomarker of exposure, the importance of the model you use to study those effects of space radiation, and what is more specific to space radiation, as other people say, is the need of good shielding, that would be like physical shielding, or also using radioprotector for astronauts. There was a very interesting talk on Monday concerning the nutrition and the effect of diet of astronauts, but we can also think about drugs that could increase radio resistance of those astronauts. And yeah, that was a very interesting conference.
So my name is Werner Rühm. I'm from the Institute of Radiation Medicine of the Helmholtz Center, Munich, Germany. I'm a physicist by training, and I worked in radioecology, dosimetry, risk assessment, and currently I'm, for example, interested in neutron spectrometry of neutrons, secondary neutrons from cosmic radiation to assess doses to aircrew, but also, and this is another common topic with therapy, to assess doses from secondary neutrons during proton and ion therapy. Now, I'm also chairing the European Radiation Dosimetry Group, EURADOS. Now, I'm specifically happy to be here. Well, there are many reasons, good reasons to come to Australia and to visit Adelaide, of course. But why I'm specifically excited to be here is because of my involvement with ICRP. I'm chairing Committee 1 on radiation effects, and in particular, the new formed task group 115, which was already mentioned several times today, on the assessment of doses and risks for astronauts in space. So basically, I'm learning a lot from you all here. Well, the grand challenges, it's a huge challenge of human spaceflight and long-term exploration missions. I mean, this is obvious, but also in terms of biological effects. And this is of particular importance, I feel, also for ICRP, because many of those effects are of relevance for ICRP as well, not just for looking at effects of astronauts. And if you look at the work program of Committee 1, we are working, or we have a task group on individual response of humans to ionizing radiation. And this is something which is of relevance, of course, for radiation protection in general, but specifically here for astronauts, because here radiation protection, there are concepts by the various space agencies where this concept of individualization is already practiced. So distinguish between males and females, for example. So this is something we can learn perhaps for general radiation protection. There are other issues. For example, Committee 1 has a working party on cardiovascular diseases. Again, if you look at the endpoint of relevance, this could be an endpoint for astronauts as well. hereditary effects. We have a working party on that. And again, this was briefly touched already today in one of the talks. So there are many issues which are really, really interesting. I mean, per se, if we look at space exposures, but also in general, more general for radiation, radiological protection on Earth. And this is why I'm so excited and why I'm here. And I hope we all together can, once we develop comments, questions, answers, learn from each other. And in particular, we as ICRP hope to learn and benefit from this very, very particular event here in Adelaide, in Australia. Thank you.
So again, I just want to echo the same comments. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Samy El-Jaby. I'm from Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, and my background is in radiation physics, nuclear engineering, and medical physics. But the majority of my work in the last 10 years is focused on space exploration studies, so trying to model the space environment and understand the dose that astronauts would get for various scenarios. And I had the fortunate opportunity to work with the Canadian Space Agency. So Canadian Nuclear Laboratories is a government-owned lab, and we do work for the interest of the government of Canada. So one of our customers is the CSA. And in the last 5-6 years, we've had the opportunity to work with them on a number of projects, and recently it's focused on quantifying radiation risk for deep space exploration. So that's the topic I'm working on now. So it's a new field for me. My background is in physics. It's not radiobiology, applied physics such as dosimetry, et cetera. I'm mostly a computational modeler. But one of the challenges, I think, in my perspective and what I've seen today in the last couple of days is that the volume of challenges ahead of us can't be solved by one person alone or one discipline alone. And I think we already knew that. Most of us already know that, but it's kind of highlighted here or emphasized. So if you look at the space radiation environment, it's made up of many different radiation species, and the damage that can cause on biological systems are what we want to know. We want to know if we measure dose on the body, what does that mean to our health moving forward? Now, if we had to answer that question alone, we'll never get there. And I think the main point I want to make here are two main points I want to make here are, for us to answer that, we need to work together. So as a physicist, I need to talk to a radiobiologist, and the radiobiologist needs to talk to applied mathematicians so that you can figure out the risk metrics, et cetera, et cetera. And the other things we need to worry about are logistics. So in Canada, we don't have access, for example, to heavy ion beams to do some of these studies in many different areas. So if I can't do that on my own, and I need to talk to the person in the US or Europe or elsewhere to see, can you help me with this area, or can I support your work moving forward, so that we don't replicate, but we all go towards the same ultimate goal. And the second point I want to make is that the mining sector and the medicine sector that we saw the last couple of days also have a stake in this. We're all in it together in the sense that we all want to know the same thing. We all want to know what's going to happen to me if I get a dose. Am I going to be healthy moving forward? Am I going to have a sickness moving forward? That's the same topic. It's the same idea. And we all, if we look closely enough, we can see how we can benefit each other. So I had the fortunate opportunity to meet people in radiation protection, people in different areas. So for example, mining and in medicine. And some of the practices that they have there, just like in the nuclear industry where I work, can be applied for deep space protection. So some of the lessons you've learned can help us, and some of the lessons we learn can help you. And I think moving forward, if we take a closer look, that's an area I think where we can immediately have an impact moving forward.
Very good. My name is Wes Balch. I'm a professor of biomedical engineering and teach at the University of Florida in the medical physics program. I'm a member of Committee 2. I had the fortunate situation about 8 years ago of having a PhD student that wrote for a NASA fellowship, and he earned that fellowship. And he tried to look at the issue of the computational phantoms used by NASA for organ dosimetry for things like at the ISS, either intravehicular or extravehicular. At that time, we had just created, in partnership with the NCI, a phantom library. So we had a large library of male and female computational phantoms of different heights and weights. And we looked at what NASA was using, and they were using essentially a 50th percentile single male and a single female computational model kind of a very robust, stylized phantom for their organ dosimetry. So through his NASA fellowship, we got data on the height and weight distribution of the current astronaut corps, and he developed essentially 6 phantoms, a 10th, 50th, and 90th female, and a 10th, 50th, and 90th male. And we did some simulations looking at EVA exposures, trap proton exposures, GCR exposures. And it was essentially meaningful changes in organ dosimetry for individuals that are not 50th percentile in the astronaut corps. And if you could think of large Russian engineers and petite Japanese female scientists, they're not all 50th percent, they're not all reference individuals. And so it raised the issue of looking at individual specific computational phantoms. So I'll make a point out, Robert, if you want to send me a whole body CT, I'll make a phantom for you if you want to send that back. Now, granted, the organ dosimetry is probably the lowest hanging fruit in terms of the chain of things needed to get to risk. It's probably the least important in terms of uncertainties, but it's something that we can do further. And then following that NASA fellowship, we did have a contract with Mark's group at JFC to look at, okay, well, we could do this by a phantom library. That is, the astronaut can, if we don't do an astronaut-specific phantom, we can do height and weight matching to an existing phantom library. But they were interested in saying, well, what if we take your reference phantom and we just sculpt it? And so it was interesting. They sent us a collection of, they had some members representing astronauts. They put bodysuits on and they stood in the T position, and they sent us a body surface mesh, and we wrote some software that would take our reference adult male or reference adult female and morph the outer body contour. Now, granted, at that point, we're scaling upward and downward the internal organ, so we knew we didn't quite have the internal organ shape, depth, and position correctly, but at least the exterior body shape matched, and that proved to be almost maybe even slightly better than the height and weight matching from the library. So there's some interesting things from the ICRP, the computational phantoms, that can maybe brought to NASA and other space agencies in terms of individualizing your dose assessment. But there again, I'm fully aware that quality factor uncertainties and radiation risk models far swamp the organ dosimetry. But we can do some interesting things with organ dosimetry moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. I think I have a good number of questions here, so I'll start with some of the questions, because some of them go back through the sessions we've had today. So the first one is in relation to the 3% REID, and I think I was also interested in having this discussion, considering, I suppose, the variation that we currently see across different countries and for what career dose limits they establish, and that there is that variation, and variation with gender. If we're moving from our space exploration as it currently stands towards going to Mars, what steps do we need to take to set dose limits or career dose limits if you are venturing further and further afield when you know that those limits will be exceeded? Interested for your thoughts.
So I think the question is the 3% inappropriate across the board, right? We have age and gender dependent dose limits simply because we fixed the risk at 3% regardless of age and gender of the astronaut. And I think there's some question, I'll be curious to know where did that 3%, how did we settle on the 3%? So that was one thing. I remember, I think in an NCRP committee discussion, obviously there's all other risks, essentially losing oxygen, getting caught in one of those dust storms, and having an explosion on the spacecraft. But the issue is if you make it back to Earth from a round trip Mars, then those risks are, you've made it, right? So you don't worry about those risks anymore, but it's the residual risk, which cancer would be one. So, but I'd be interested to see where the 3% came from, and I guess that's pretty fixed in stone at this point, right?
the other point, and Dr. Rühm, you probably can correct me better, that 3%, doesn't describe the uncertainty in these risk models, and I think there's a lot of area of improvement in those risk models themselves. So it could be that if down the line 10 years, people like Mélanie, for example, come up with a better radiological model and give you a better estimate that they can pinpoint the risk better, and then that 3% might still be in place, but their dose limits might be higher because the risk is better quantified at that point. So.
In addition to that, actually we had sort of discussion yesterday in our new task group where we had the kickoff. And one issue we should keep in mind is that currently there is no harmonized or general practice how to calculate risk and which kind of career limits or dose limits you would apply. And this is one of the challenging tasks, I would say, we face as a task group, to understand how the different approaches were identified, or the reasons for those different approaches, and then come up with something to suggest something more harmonized or to give recommendations as ICRP now. So this is actually one of the challenges, and this is a good example, 3%.
I think it comes down to risk acceptance. I think Bob, you said this morning that it's every astronaut's dream to go to Mars potentially, and is it the astronaut who would accept a risk like that? In fact, there are many other risks that they accept more routinely, and I think, Bob, you quoted statistics once that your risk of dying on launch is like 1 in 250 or some horrendous statistic, just the failure of the launch system. And the 3% lifetime risk is, I guess, small by comparison. But who wears it? Who owns that risk? Is it the international agencies? Is it the astronaut? Perhaps it's an ethical question, Nikki, for you. Who owns that risk and who is the person that accepts it at the end of the day? Most astronauts, I guarantee you, would accept a higher risk than that if it meant that they would be the first boots on Mars.
So my question to Nikki, could we have a different informed consent? Do you want to sign the 3% informed consent? Do you want to sign the 10% risk informed consent?
I think that's really tricky. The ethicist in me just spun my head around several times, the idea of having different informed consent. But I think it does highlight the fact that different occupations are willing to take a different type of risk, and I think so as an astronaut you would agree, and the military as well.
Okay. Oh, which one do I pick? Okay, this is, it relates back to the dose estimation and risk calculation. What is the best mechanism to achieve harmonisation across the globe in dose estimation and risk calculation in space travel?
So let's say in 2 years from now, I can answer your question. So at the next ICRP symposium, maybe. So if you all come to the next symposium, maybe we will answer this question. At the moment, I cannot.
Okay. Going back to an earlier question, and this one, well, it was in relation to the presentation that Lena gave this morning. It wasn't clear to me why FISH, F-I-S-H, specifically is used on the astronaut blood samples. Now it's just vanished. The doses are very uncertain and the links to health effects unclear. Other assays also applied.
So, full disclosure, I'm not a radiobiologist. I think that came from Health Canada, and the expertise at Health Canada at that in that particular area has developed. But in terms of biomarkers, I think that's one of the main questions that people have, is what's the correct biomarker to proceed with. FISH was used, I believe, Lena, you can correct me, it's been around for a while. It's one of the state-of-the-art techniques that they developed or they inherited and put into place at the time. And I know for a fact that Health Canada is actively working towards new biomarkers, but those are not necessarily ready for spaceflight at the moment. So it's a good question. It's a valid question, but in terms of biology, I think that's the key question. I think if you can find a better biomarker, by all means, we'll take it. It's just, we have to find that one first before we get there. So.
So it's just, sorry, I'm butting in. So it's basically, so that was an international standard that was selected. We're going back to, in the beginning, ISS. We had to make sure we all use same assay. And that was really, went into the medical requirements documents. And we used that and we standardized that across the agency so we could compare. But given, it doesn't mean that there's a lot of uncertainty in this whole area. And for instance, Health Canada applies other assays as well, but that's kind of like the gold standard because we had to pick one to be able to compare across agencies, but it doesn't mean that it is it cannot be improved.
And just to add to that, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, where I work, we have a whole section devoted just to develop new biomarkers for nuclear accidents, terrorism-style events, etc. So it's an active area study, as Lena mentioned, and part of that, our lab for that specific area works with Health Canada in support of the Canadian Space Agency in that sense as well. So.
All right. So this is a question along for you, Nikki. From a purely ethical standpoint, in the face of so much uncertainty around health effects and other risks, should we send humans to Mars or indeed into space at all?
Oh, that's a really good question. Whoever asked it, well done. I think for millennia, we have been adventurers searching the globe and pushing the envelopes, and we pushed the envelope to go to the moon and out into space over 50 years ago now. And I think initially robotics will help quite a bit, but I think it's not just about the technical, it's about the inspirational as well, and it's about reaching beyond and challenging ourselves as humans. Having said that, we need to limit the risk as much as we possibly can, but I think being able to stop people going into space will be quite difficult. Firstly, from a aspirational perspective, but then when you look at the huge number of not just startups but large commercial space private companies now and the control that we have over them. Can you imagine controlling Elon Musk and telling him he's not allowed to send someone to space? I think we'd have great problems with actually doing that. So we might as well regulate it to ensure that we reduce the risk. But thank you for the question.
Well, I agree. When I look back on my life, I think I've tried to act such that I always do things that take me far out of my comfort zone. And the things that I've accomplished most significantly that brought the most benefit, that provided the most personal fulfillment, is when I've done things that were risky. And the best decisions that I've made in life are those decisions that I made when I was uncertain whether or not I should go one way or another. And I think that's a good approach for organizations that wish to innovate and for nations that wish to make a difference. If we just get used to doing things that are safe and where the outcome is predicted, we're not going to advance as individuals, we're not going to advance as societies. So having said that, it doesn't mean that I take silly risks. No, I take calculated risks, which means that, yeah, when I launch on the space shuttle, in the early days of the space shuttle, we calculated the risk of a disaster during launch to be 1 in 57. And I knew that. It's an uncertainty associated with that, of course. But the opportunity to fulfill a childhood dream, to work with the best individuals in the world, to work with the best organizations in the world, to extend human capability into space, to inspire the next generation of people, those advantages greatly exceeded the tiny, tiny, tiny risk of morbidity or mortality. So yeah, we do things again, because they're hard, they're not easy, because it's an opportunity to measure the best of our energies and our skills.
I agree as well. As I mentioned in my opening remarks as well, it is part of our DNA to be explorers, but I think you also have to recognise the technological benefits that arise from human spaceflight, the techniques, the technologies, the innovations that occur to support humans in that very challenging environment we use every day on Earth, and it improves human health and population health here. The ability to support humans at that, in those challenging environments at an extreme distance, for example, has enormous spin-off benefits for people here on Earth in remote and extreme environments, and never mind about all the technologies. So I think from that perspective, humans going to space is a platform for not only exploration, but for research and development and betterment of the human species.
Okay. All right, this is a, I suppose, more technical question. Will engineering solutions such as high-temp graphene active shielding mitigate more of the charged particle dose?
All right, I'll be brave.
Anyone willing to attempt to answer that question?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but it's about active shielding, and I mean, yes, it's being examined. I think the energy equation is the problem in providing enough energy to the technology to provide active shielding. So that technology is a way off, as far as I understand. But there's certainly there's technologies being looked at for generating a little magnetosphere around a spacecraft and so on, but I'm not sure that the energy equation is going to add up when mass, volume, energy and so on are at a real premium for any space mission that you're talking about. So that technology is a way off. I don't know whether I missed the point of that question, but
I think Mark Shavers had mentioned that as well. Active shielding.
Active shielding. The question was about active shielding, and I'm sorry I didn't hear it in detail. The possibility of using active shielding is very real. We had a discussion this morning about it, Dr. Hirth and I. The idea is you just have just enough curvature, and I mentioned this, just enough curvature from the magnetic field around an inhabitable volume that you displace the galactic cosmic rays, which are always present, just enough to have a safe volume. You have some operational issues with regard to communications because you can't get radio and other signals through these fields. You also can't have very strong fields around your human occupants, so you have to be careful with that as well. The studies that I'm aware of in the past have shown that even with superconducting magnets, warm temperatures, you still need a lot of energy and a lot of mass, and you get almost as much gain from the passive shielding of the materials that are needed. So that said, there are some studies going on. NASA is actively investigating that. I think there will be a talk at the NCRP meeting next April, I believe it is, by Dan Fry on active shielding, electrostatic shielding that he's working on now. So there is a possibility of using it. It's probably more practical on a planetary surface than it is up in free space around a vehicle.
Thank you. All right, so many questions. It's hard to keep track of which ones have been answered and which ones are still. All right, I'm going to come back to a question. This is around the use of nuclear or other radioactive materials for space colonisation. So is there a concern that the use of nuclear or other radioactive materials for space colonisation may result in significant contamination in the event of high-speed landing, launch failure on a planet such as Mars?
In the nuclear industry, that's one of the concerns, is radioactive waste. And it's a concern because it's our environment. So if we pollute the water stream next to the to the town and they all drink the water, and then they're all going to get contamination because they drink the water. I understand the point of that question. I think, and Mark would know better, I guess, coming from NASA, they've used RTGs for a very long time, and it's been used extensively. So it's a known technology, and I think that risk is small compared to all the other challenges that they have. So even if they did crash into Mars, for example, it's going to be an isolated location, and the amount of nuclear material there is not going to be significant enough to cause you that much contamination, that you'd have to worry about it in the long run. So.
Okay. All right, going back to radiation protection frameworks, how do you propose to deal with radiation protection of commercial space travel workers in an industry where the benefits are hardly tangible? A radiation dose to satisfy the ego of billionaires.
Can you repeat that?
How do you propose to deal with radiation protection of commercial space travel workers in an industry where the benefits are hardly tangible? So I suppose it's the justification reason. A radiation dose to satisfy the ego of billionaires.
I don't think it should make a difference whether somebody's a commercial space worker or whether they're an astronaut. They still deserve the same protection because we're all the same humans, and the same regulations should apply to both. Would be, I'm sorry if I've just killed somebody's much better answer. And I think we need to be active in ensuring that all of our workers on the Earth and in space, wherever they are protected.
So I mentioned at the beginning, this is an area where we can learn different lessons from different groups. And I saw a presentation by somebody I just met at this conference, and she's looking at trying to protect surgeons, for example, who refuse to wear their TLD because they're busy trying to save a life. So that culture change of trying to make sure that they're safe is something that they need to work on as part of what ICRP does, is to try to communicate those risks. So moving forward, I think that's one of the areas that they're looking at, obviously, for aircrew radiation. Suborbital is part of this as well, so it's one of the things that they're looking at as well. So.
Yeah. The premise of the question, Gillian, was that there's no tangible benefit to commercial spaceflight potentially?
Yes.
I would argue that that's not the case. I think the success of future missions will be reliant upon a successful collaboration between commercial companies and the sovereign agencies. I think international government space agencies will continue to explore deep space, but I think the low Earth orbit realm may well be handed over to commercial ventures. But of course, commercial operators are even now resupplying the International Space Station and are essential to NASA's operations. So I think the base of that question is, as Nikki said, same for all, because that requirement or that service is essential to our exploratory ambitions.
I do think there's a role for governments to continue to play a role in regulatory affairs for government space agencies and activities, but also the commercial sector as well. So broader than just the radiation question, I'm a little bit disappointed with some of the steps that the commercial sector has taken over the last few years. I am the biggest fan of the commercial sector taking over low Earth orbit and allowing government space agencies to work to explore deep space. I'm a fan of that. But one of the things that worries me as an astronaut is orbital debris. And on 3 occasions when I was aboard the space station, we had to raise the orbit of the International Space Station because it was predicted that a piece of space debris was going to pass too close to, worrisomely close to the station, and we could have had a disaster. We currently know of 30,000 pieces of junk in space that are the size of a grapefruit or bigger. And if you consider the small pieces as well, down to millimeter sizes, there's probably over 200,000 objects up there that could kill astronauts in space. 60 years ago, before the age of before the space age began, space was pristine, but humans have this habit of wherever we go, we tend to trash, and we tend to bring our mess and our bad habits with us. So yeah, it's a matter of culture, of the leadership. So I really hope that the leadership of the commercial companies will foster a culture of responsibility for the planet, responsibility for the people, and after that, worry about profit.
Can I say that there are actually some excellent companies who are actually working on that? So Rocket Labs in New Zealand are a beacon in ethical decision making at the moment in a lot of their decisions that they're making, both in regards to deorbiting debris that they put up there and also in regard to their interaction with First Peoples, with the Indigenous people, with the Maori people. But there are many companies that need to come to the light to learn, I think, of doing things in a different way and seeing their corporate responsibilities. But there are companies such as Rocket Labs who are making it commercially viable to actually act in not just an ethical way, but a sustainable way and looking at the long term. So I think you're absolutely right.
All right, I'd like to ask the audience if there are any questions from the floor. Please come to the microphone. Yes, George.
Question. In low Earth orbit, or in the space station, are the people there members of the public, or are they occupationally exposed?
I think we're both. It's an occupation that all of us have as professional astronauts. Occasionally, we will fly a civil scientist, we used to call them payload specialists, or a space tourist, and they would not be professionally engaged as astronauts. So there are some members of the public, but the vast majority are professionals.
No, the question was, are they occupationally exposed because the regulatory limit is some number, or are they members of the public and the regulatory limit is some number much lower? And so my question, for example, what was your radiation dose while you were up in space?
I think in low Earth orbit, we're exposed to 300 millisieverts per year. And I think I saw my data this morning, it was about 200 millisieverts.
All right. So you are not a member of the public. You are essentially occupationally exposed.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So may I just add, I mean, this was a bit ICRP language, right? Occupational exposure of the public. And I just want to add that whether all the ICRP regulations or the regulations in radiological protection in place hold for astronauts, this is not at all clear. I mean, this is a very specific group. I just wanted to add that.
No, I think the Canadian regulations characterize a member of the public, and they also characterize someone who is occupationally exposed. And you should be trained and monitored and all kinds of reasonable things. And you receive 300 millisieverts, rough number, so therefore you would fall into the occupationally exposed category. And in the United States and other countries, they also make this differentiation between a member of the public and someone who's occupationally exposed. I think I'm seeing a gray area, and no pun intended here, where people in low Earth orbits can receive a dose much greater than for a member of the public, but less than the maximum for someone occupationally exposed. I'd like your thoughts about that. Wes,
I think
that.
Clearly the space agencies do not have dose limits for members of the public, period, at this point.
But the United States government does. The NRC says for occupationally exposed, it's so many rem. I apologize for that. And for a member of the public, it's 100 millirem.
But it's more analogous to an airline pilot that may be regulated in Europe but not in the States.
Well, so astronauts do have dose limits set in place by their agencies. Those are higher than occupational dose limits set in place for public workers working at occupations for which they receive a dose, like a nuclear energy worker. So they are occupational workers in that sense. Their limits are higher than what you get if you were an occupational worker but a member of the public. So for example, I work at a nuclear laboratory. I'm allowed up to 20 millisieverts per year, average over 5 years. My brother does not work at a nuclear laboratory. He's only allowed 1 millisievert per year, average over 5 years. Ulrich can answer this. He's his background. So.
All what was said is correct, and we have to understand that spaceflight, professional spaceflight, commercial professional spaceflight, as it will come up, all that didn't happen in a vacuum. And radiation protection and the regulations of radiation protection, of course, also have their history. And among the motivations that made that all that happen is also the fact that it was to protect the genetic pool. So it's one thing if you expose a group of a couple of hundred people that have been up to space now, or if you if your job is to protect an entire society. Yeah, that would be again a topic for Nikki that she certainly would be happy to answer to. But bottom line is that of course we have to have a certain understanding that all that has to grow. And we heard already this morning that there have been made approaches to the IAEA because they released the basic safety standards to have a grip on that. Meaning, if we on the one side regulate that everybody that gets the most of his radiation due to his occupation is per definition an occupationally exposed worker, then of course an astronaut flying is an occupational exposed worker. At the same time, we might send him to a CAT scan to understand how healthy he is, and we can very, very thoroughly debate in how far that is a proper mixture. What we can do and what we have to do is we have to my mind, understand what radiation does to the human body, and we have to educate the people that are exposed to radiation, which is more or less all of us. By the way, everybody more than 1 millisievert, which would be the limit for the public. So to put all that into a, what shall I say, proper workable context, we have to see not only one side and not only black and white, but we have to understand what we want to do with the regulations that we put on people.
Yes, guys.
This is again something to do with how to classify the exposure. Earlier this afternoon, I learned from Dr. Komiyama's the presentation that in JAXA in Japan, the exposure associated with a physical medical examination as an astronaut are classified as a occupational exposure. I think this might be they classified as the medical exposure. So probably it is very important to distinguish between the occupational exposure and the medical exposure. So, and in that sense too, the exposure to astronaut is a very big challenge for the radiological protection system.
Dr. Clement.
Yes, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. We've delved a lot in the last few minutes into what is radiological protection. This is the system of radiological protection that ICRP has built for now over 91 years. So there's a lot of history in it. And I think it's fair to say that for most of those years, there was no space flight or even air flight. And the system of protection that we have today wasn't built specifically with humans going into space in mind. That's not to say that I believe many of the principles, many of the basic ideas apply very well equally, whether we're on Earth, on Mars, somewhere in between. But one of the reasons that we've been involved in work in radiological protection for astronauts, starting about 10 years ago, but more intensively now, is because we're facing challenges we haven't faced before. Humans on Earth don't tend to get 1 millisievert per day anywhere. But if you're traveling to Mars, well, that's probably about what you're getting. So I think one of the reasons we have the task group that Werner's chairing right now is to look at a subset of the questions that need to be raised to perhaps adapt the system of protection that we have now to make sure that exploration of space is done safely within the same system of protection that's used for here on Earth, but maybe not the exact same system that we use today because it wasn't envisioned 20 years ago, 91 years ago that we'd have people in space. My belief is that this task group will do, and perhaps subsequent task groups will do an excellent job in helping frame the international framework for radiological protection in space. But at the same time, we've begun a review of the system of protection for here on Earth. In fact, that should apply for every human being and non-human biota, in fact. And I believe that the work being done here for RP in space will also influence that discussion. We see individual sensitivity as an issue in both. Clearly, in astronauts, it's used already. It's interesting that risk is used as a protection quantity for astronauts. We don't do that for Earthbound people, but it raises a question. We look at whether or not there should be more individualized phantoms. How individualized should our radiological protection be? All of these questions are crucial questions for RP in space, already being addressed in part, but also something that lets us exercise our minds a bit, looking outside the box of the Earth. Will improve, I think, our system of protection for people on Earth as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Look for any more questions from the floor? Not at the moment. Okay. Here's an issue. No, I won't.
Skip over that one.
Oh, dear. It was a question about jurisdictional responsibility. What radiation protection jurisdiction applies on Mars or in space? I'm going to come back to an ethical question. Nikki, can you comment on the ethics of creating a more radio-resistant human being through natural selection, breeding or otherwise?
So selective breeding, is that the question? Are we wanting to speed up evolution by standing someone in a... yeah, okay. I think naturally over time we will evolve, and I think we are earthbound currently, but we've been seafarers and we've colonised other continents, and I think the chances of us colonising another planet are quite high, and that those people will over time evolve. And will we be the same? I don't know. We have different accents on different continents. Will we have a different accent on Mars? Will we have different gene expressions? At this stage, I don't know. But I think my concern is when we have the heavy hand of us trying to speed that up. If we're talking about human genome modification, that concerns me greatly. Because of the long-term unintended consequences for ourselves and for potential generations. Does that answer that question?
Yes, Samy?
Before selecting, modifying the genome of human, what would be the ethical consequences of selecting the astronauts on their radio sensitivity or lack thereof? Would it be one more selection and one more risks that the radio-sensitive astronaut, if he or she is radio-sensitive, or could it be a selection that prevents someone from being an astronaut?
And I just take it a scale down. We all have family members who probably had cancer. What if we figured out a cure for cancer tomorrow? That's all something that I think we want if we can avoid losing a loved one, that we'd have a cure for cancer, that we'd accept it. So the same idea, if you can protect your astronauts on the way to Mars and figure out how to cure cancer, then we're still doing that already. So.
That actually relates back to a question we have here. Given progress in treating cancer, do we need to worry about a 3% level when in 20 years treating different cancers may no longer be a major concern?
I defer to the doctors in the room. I would say if you can cure cancer, you've solved it. I don't think that's a problem. I think if you can do it, go for it. But in the meantime, you have to practice ALERA as low as reasonably achievable and practice radiation protection as best achievable moving forward.
So Gillian, just to clarify the question, so is the question, if we can cure cancer, then radiation ceases to be an issue? Is that sort of the premise of it?
Yes.
Yeah, well, there are other risks other than carcinogenesis from radiation. An example, which is a common radiation risk of astronauts occupationally, is cataracts, for example. So it's one consideration. The other consideration, of course, is reproductive and the effect on germ cells in the body. And if we are going to colonise, if we are going to produce offspring in a radiation environment, clearly there are going to be some implications there. And we know nothing about that currently. So I think, yes, curing cancer is fantastic and may remove one element of the equation, of the risk equation, but I think there are other health concerns that we need to address as well.
I mean,
So I saw on someone's slide this morning that another one of the effects of radiation could be cognitive decline as well. If my wife was sitting here, she would say, that explains everything.
And indeed cardiovascular risk as well. The endothelium is thought to be affected. So there's a number of body systems which can be implicated in disease processes.
I just want to support this. So even if cancer is no more a problem, we have to look at non-cancer effects as well, and we do so. So we are looking and following the science at the moment and try to find out whether we should add, for example, in the detriment calculation, whether non-cancer effects should be added, whether the evidence is already sufficient or not. So this is still another example how those questions, which come maybe now from our discussions on space effects, are very, very relevant for radiological protection on Earth as well.
So I think in this scenario where we can cure cancer on Earth, I hope we can do it on Mars too, because if you diagnose on Mars and you need to come back to Earth to get cure, I mean, there's need to be able to do it there.
And I think that comes back to the simple fact that from the very first presentation of today, the number of hazards and challenges just logistically in getting to Mars and all the infrastructure that's required. There are a lot of hurdles to get over before we may even be able to send a human to Mars. All right. Yes, Maria.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is not for me. Thank you very much, Maria Perez from the World Health Organization. I want to make a comment particularly regarding this question on what if the cancer is cured, because I think we are all working, all people, all who are working in health, the aspiration is to achieve the highest possible level of health. And, but I don't see why we will have a different philosophy with regards to radiation protection when looking at radiation protection in the space or in the Earth. I remember that when we started discussing the international radiation basis safety standards, to put that paragraph, one of the points that we raise is we would protect the human beings. Doesn't matter whether the person is standing in any part of the Earth or outside the Earth. Our philosophy will be the same, to think about whether or not is an occupationally exposed or a member of the public. I think we should use the same criteria, And in this particular case, with talking about health, we should not think about whether or not cancer will be cured. I hope it will be, most of them will be cured. We think about detriment, and that is the philosophy of this system of radiation protection is about detriment. And detriment is not just fatality, dying because of I may have cancer, it's also any kind of impact on the quality of the health. If I have cataract and I have to be treated, or if I have a non-cancer disease, is much more than dying because of something. So I think that in my perspective, is also the philosophy and the ethical principles that we should keep when protecting workers that will travel to the space as astronauts, or even in the future, if they are members of the public that decide to do it. Thinking more about detriment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments from the panel? Yes?
You've raised one thing which I just wanted to quickly reinforce, is that it's not just astronauts, it's not just payload specialists, it's not just those who are going to be driving the bus, for want of a better term, for commercial operators. Made in Space, which actually are a commercial group that have a 3D printer on the space station, was speaking to me last year about creating a manufacturing facility off the ISS, but in orbit. And so they were sort of talking about what the impact would be and what those workers would be called. Are they astronauts? Are they space manufacturers? But we have to consider the exposure that they're going to have as well. So the number and the complex roles of people in space is only going to go up exponentially.
One of the many reasons I like to associate with your community, with the radiation protection community, is because of this acronym you have, ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. I think that when I talk to some of my friends about radiation protection, they say, well, Bob, why don't you just build the spacecraft out of lead? And then I have to explain, well, we can't launch a spacecraft that's made out of lead, so we use lighter weight materials. It doesn't give us as good protection, as good shielding as lead, but it's as low as reasonably achievable. So I agree with the point that you just made. It's not just for spaceflight, but for Earth as well. I see a number of national societies that are not pursuing as low as reasonably achievable. I travel around the world, and I see some states where you can drive a motorcycle without a helmet. Like, why is that allowed? And I see some drugstores that sell cigarettes. Why is that allowed? So I think that we need to take some of these practices from spaceflight and apply them to terrestrial society as well.
And just coming back to the health detriment, I would be interested to know the views. Reflecting on the discussions that we had in the medical session yesterday, and the patient advocate and the experience of her exposure to radiation, but not so much the expected effects that she was probably more aware of, but some of those longer term non-cancer health effects that the information that's provided not just to patients but also to potential space workers. How much information should you be providing about the risks and potential longer-term health effects that they may experience as part of an informed consent process? And is there things that we can learn from the medical community in that space?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that. Nikki, might be you, but just reflecting on the diversity of the potential for space workers in the future, I may be digressing here slightly, but there are companies currently exploring space hotels, inflatable modules, and even for those of you of the 60s generation like Bob and I, 2001, remember the big spacecraft, the spinning von Braun wheel type spacecraft. there are designs being explored to actually do that, which means there will be workers in hotels who are exposed to radiation in low Earth orbit. Now, it's not beyond magnetosphere kind of radiation, but nonetheless of the sort that the ISS is currently experiencing. So what do we provide to those people in terms of information about risk? Are they compelled to do that by their employer? Are they exposed? Well, they would be exposed occupationally, but there would have to be exposure limits for those individuals. So I'm not sure that answers the question, but I was just thinking then, as we were talking about manufacturing in space, the tourist industry will be booming, I think, very soon. As soon as the general public gets a view of that beautiful blue orb of the Earth from orbit, that is going to drive a wave of tourism. So there will be workers associated with that, I would think. Sorry, Nikki.
I'd go to a space hotel. I think that would be awesome.
Space Quidditch. I'm looking forward to
I'm hoping that we learn from our mistakes. So I'm hoping that we learn from stories like your patient advocate about how much information we need to give them and in what kind of format. Because giving them reams of journal articles doesn't work. We've found that. And giving them simplified information sometimes doesn't work either. So I'm hoping that we learn and build on, learn from our mistakes and build on what we know now to ensure that we're actually going forward and improving on the medical situation for space workers and for space tourists as well. Yes.
Coming back to the statement that Bob had mentioned about the space debris, that was pretty alarming to me. And now we're talking about putting up hotels. It would seem before we allow that, I don't even know if it's even physically possible. Is there a way of cleaning up low Earth orbit? It sounds like that would be pretty, we talk about space as radiation is a hazard. It sounds like the space debris is maybe even more of a hazard.
Can I answer that one? Yes, there is a lot of research being done on space debris. Things like nets, magnets, harpoons. Let me terrify you further, because this is my area of research. Anything that can be used to remove space debris can be used as an active weapon against an active satellite, which means that it puts it into legal, difficult waters, both legally and diplomatically, which is, I have to say, dampening the research in this area. But it is absolutely vital, because if we don't clean up low Earth orbit, it's going to be worse than the climate crisis in the long run.
Yeah. Just curious, the space debris, what are the major, is this old satellites that don't fully disintegrate when they deorbit? Or?
It can be anything from a tool that's inadvertently dropped by an astronaut doing an EVA through to entire satellites that have been intentionally destroyed by certain sovereign nations, which has left debris flying around in orbit faster than a rifle bullet, which of course, as you can imagine, going through a spacesuit or a space station plays havoc. But just to scare you even further...
You're doing a good job, right?
You're never going to want to go to a space hotel, are you? We now are in the situation, of course, where commercial companies with the Internet of Things in mind and communications are thinking of putting up swarms of satellites, hundreds or thousands of satellites which work together just to add to the confusion on orbit. Now, my concern about all of this, it's wonderful talking about radiation protection and going to Mars, but we may not ever be able to leave the surface of the planet unless we clean up orbit. We just won't get through the debris. Luckily, I've got to say, our own space agency, the Australian Space Agency, is acting very, very ethically. They're constantly talking about being a good global citizen in looking after our space around the Earth, but also very much in terms of promoting space situational awareness. Australia has a lot of technologies that are world-leading in terms of tracking this stuff, and we are hoping in Australia to contribute to the international push, if we can't get rid of it, to at least know where it is and know where the threats are.
And so as I'm checking into my IBIS at 450 kilometers, is the IBIS corporation tracking who's responsible is it to track the debris? I'm just curious.
That's a really interesting, difficult question that doesn't have an easy answer. I just want to add that SpaceX has announced plans to launch 40,000 satellites in the next few years. And these aren't small satellites, these are larger. They're not CubeSats, they're actually larger than that. My favourite piece of space debris is an astronaut's glove. But unfortunately, they're not as interesting, most of them. They're small as paint flecks, as large as a rocket body. Can I suggest you watch the movie Gravity? That will terrify you.
I mean, that was okay. Hollywood. That was actually, well, anyway. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to attempt to bring it back onto some radiation protection. We have some questions.
NORAD tracks everything greater than 3 inches in size. So they track all the trash up there. And young lady is absolutely correct. It is something to worry about.
Okay, Cameron, you've been very patient.
Thanks, Gillian. I guess I really had 2 comments that may be questions or points of discussion. First was to say the modifying the system of radiological protection in a way that doesn't shut down space travel will be great. Because I love my workers being able to talk about their dose in terms of REID or REIC. That will be brilliant. But I look forward to seeing how that works and still allowing space travel to happen in the context that my workers can't get more than 20 millisievert per year. The other comment I had is surely the definition of reasonable when it comes to shielding will change when we're making things in space and we're not having to lift lead from the surface of the Earth up into low Earth orbit, and we only have to push it a little bit further out. Thank you.
Yes.
May I just add on this reasonable? This is a very, very difficult word in the whole system. It does not mean as low as possible or as low as possibly achievable, so it's as low as reasonably achievable. And this means, I mean, as I understand it, the reason behind is, yes, we would like to protect people from the negative effects of ionizing radiation, but, and this is always important, without unduly limiting the beneficial use of ionizing radiation. And I mean, I personally feel I'm excited about all this, what I heard. So I feel that this is a beneficial use, that we go to space. And so, as always, one has to find a compromise, a reasonable way to protect, in this case, astronauts, but at the same time in a way that we do not limit or kill or cancel the whole process. I mean, it will not be cancelled anyway. But so this is like an art, I would say.
And I think related to that, there's a comment or a question here that I think is a challenge for the radiation protection community. It's quite confusing how we can justify a higher radiation dose for astronauts than occupationally exposed workers on Earth or in an emergency response on Earth. How do we explain this?
Everybody that was here this morning, when they sat down, they did a safety brief. And they said, in case of emergency, you have to exit this way and go to a certain location and meet. In the nuclear industry, we do that every day. Everybody who does a job has a safety brief before they do that job. They list the risks and how to react in terms of those risks. Astronauts accept a certain risk because they're asked to do a mission. Most likely they want to do that mission. Obviously, they're not saying no, but they're asked to do a mission, but those risks are laid out for them. And they're tried, from my understanding at least, the basic understanding is that they're controlled risks. They're not just go up in space and get whatever you can and come back down. They're laid out in a process that's systematic and informed. They take more risk than a pilot does, and a pilot takes more risk than me and you do if we're sitting on Earth. So it's part of the job, it's part of the training, and it's not saying that they're necessarily going to get cancer or they have a greater risk chance of getting cancer. These are all just probability distributions. They're all just estimates or best guesses based on the data that we have. So I think it's just how do you accomplish a job without taking a certain level of risk, and you have to inform that risk. You have to understand what that risk is, and I think that's what ICRP does.
Just to add, I mean, in principle, there are the system allows for higher doses than just say 20 millisievert average in 5 years in emergencies. So for life-saving actions, there is the possibility. And this has also to do with informed consent, of course, those who go in. And just, I would like to repeat what Chris said. Of course, for this specific group, astronauts, the system was not developed. So maybe we have, and this is, by the way, a long-term goal of the task group, we have to look at whether how the system as it is currently set, how this works for this special group, whether we should adapt it somehow to cover this as well. So this is challenging, and this will take more than just a few months, I'm pretty sure. But I mean, this is one of our desires to go and develop the system further in that direction.
It depends on how many people are being impacted too. So there aren't that many astronauts, and that's going to have a smaller effect on the long-term gene pool. Whereas if we're going to apply the situation to the rest of the population that applies to astronauts, that's going to dramatically impact on a much larger population and future generations as well. So it's about considering a cumulative risk, not just for an astronaut, but for them as a group, as opposed to society in general and in the future.
I can't answer the legal, ethical aspects of that question, but I do think astronauts and many other people in society think that we should continue to explore, beyond low Earth orbit and take humanity to some of these other destinations because of the DNA that is, the exploration DNA that's part of us. Yeah, radiation risk is part of the risks that we assume when we sign on to become professional astronauts, but there's many other risks associated with the job that make radiation look like a small risk. So during launch, we sit on 2 million pounds of explosive propellant. There's a chance that we may not be returning home at the end of the mission because of the risks associated with launch and also with re-entry. Some of the psychosocial stresses that we work under, the work hours that we work under are not what your typical terrestrial worker puts up with. The training is dangerous, so we fly in high-performance aircraft, which is associated with some physiological long-term risks as well. And we put ourselves into hyperbaric or diving saturation kinds of environments that are associated with risk, decompression sickness, the bends and things like that. So for us to not assume those risks would mean that we don't explore. And it doesn't matter if you're an explorer in a research lab or a geographical explorer or a space explorer. I think you have to assume some of these risks, and it's just the price of doing something for humanity and for yourself.
And actually coming back to that, what you've just said about all of the different aspects of the health risks in particular. Going from a 6-month mission to the space station, we know that the radiation dose going to Mars is increased, but how the extrapolation from 6 months to 12 months to 18 months to 2 years to 2.5 years, and all those other physiological changes, do you see those as being exponential? I mean, the radiation dose we can estimate. I think some of those other things it may be quite harder to estimate how being in space for 2.5 years might impact.
So Gillian, that's a very fanciful question. I can't answer it, but what I can tell you is that at the end of 6 months aboard the International Space Station, I was almost ready to be coming home. And one of the other risks of long duration flight is the isolation confinement effects as well. And in that 5th month, I would get up in the morning and I'd feel tired. After just getting up, I'd feel tired. And I sort of thought, well, maybe I need to take the weekend off and just really totally relax. And I'd get up on Monday morning, I'd still feel tired. And it suddenly dawned on me that it's the psychological fatigue that was sitting in there. So If you had asked me to stay up another couple months on that flight, I could have done that, and I would have done well. But 12 months, 18 months, 2.5 years, I can't answer that question. And that's why when we talk about long duration or deep space missions, you know, the isolation and confinement is going to be another major area that we could spend a day, a month, a year studying before we're ready to send people off. It's not to be taken lightly. One of the jokes in our household is that my wife says that I never came back from my last flight. And so I asked her, what do you mean by that? Like physiologically, my bones have regained the calcium, my muscles have regained the strength. And she said, psychologically, you never returned. My head is still up there, which means that I have different perspectives and different priorities in life than I had before. She struggles to have me take care of some of the family and the household items that she thinks that I know I'm supposed to be doing a better job of taking care of.
All right, well, we have actually reached 5:30, or a tiny bit after 5:30. So I'd really like to thank everybody on the panel this afternoon, but also all of our presenters today. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating day. So many interesting presentations, questions and dialogue, and I think this will be a topic of great conversation, not just within ICRP, but I think for everybody that's learnt something new through the discussions today. So on that point, thank you very much. I think we'll do a tiny bit of rejigging and then we'll move to the closing ceremony. So thank you very much, everybody.